I just briefly wanted to thank everybody for being here this morning. And as you all may be aware, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium over the past 18 months or so has been moving forward an initiative in trying to promote early feasibility studies in the United States in electrophysiology. We've had several events over this 18 months, but as sort of 2.0 version of this, it's now time to move forward and see what we can do from a very practical aspect. So this morning is an example, I hope, of, and all of us hope, of bringing together stakeholders in a way that might lead to some practical movement in this area. Of course, I want to thank the NBIC organizers for putting this all together. And without further ado, I will give you Vivek Reddy, who probably needs not much introduction, but go ahead, Vivek.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for leading in this. So, it's interesting. EFS, the EFS program has been, it's almost as old now as my oldest child. It's just over a decade old and has actually had a lot of success in the structural heart space, as all of you know or may know. Less so in the EP space. And I think that's what prompted certainly the work that Pete's been trying to lead. And most recently, and sort of as the background to this this hour that we're going to spend, when Bram and Andy and Hetal spoke to me, I think the idea for this webinar is to bring together the different stakeholders, as Pete mentioned. And the idea is to see, is to bring everyone together and hopefully talk about where the successes have been from the structural heart space, but also now we're seeing the beginnings in the EP space, as well as where there may be some challenges that we can continue to overcome. And honestly, part of it is just to educate all of us. I mean, there's aspects of the program that I didn't fully understand, even though I've been part of these meetings now for several times over the past couple of years. So on this call, of course, there are members from the FDA, the members from the MDIC, which sort of provides the framework, and we're going to hear a little bit more, I think, from Eileen. They're, let's say, successful EPs in the EP space, particularly Devi, and who's going to talk about her experience, and I'll talk a little bit about mine a little later. There's also various industry representatives from various stages, and by stages, I mean we have some that are sort of the larger companies, some that are more early stage companies. We have some that have actually gone through the EFS program completely, others that are starting to go through the program, and others that are thinking about it and at the stage where they're considering how and where and when to do their first in human work. So anyway, hopefully this will be a good discussion. So at this point, I think I want to hand it over to Andy to sort of provide a framework of what we're going to be talking about from the FDA perspective of how the program is constructed. And again, the hope is that these sort of didactic parts of this webinar are going to be relatively short, and we'll have a more open discussion after that. So Andy, with that, please.
Thanks, Vivek, and good morning, everybody. I'm the CMO of the FDA's Office of Cardiovascular Devices and the co-leader of the Center's Early Feasibility Studies program for medical devices. And as Vivek alluded to, it's been the guidance rolled out about 10 years ago. That's when the program was in its earliest stages, and it's made good progress. It's really a foundational program, very important to FDA. Also, we recognize to device developers, the industry, investigators, clinicians, and most importantly, to increase access of beneficial medical devices to patients. And we see a good deal of opportunities in the dynamic space of EP devices and EP technology development. And we look at this as a partnership with all those on the call today to try to keep our forward momentum in this area. And with that, I want to thank MDIC and Eileen for putting this together and helping organize it, moderators Vivek and Pete, and all the panelists and participants today. Thanks. And back to you, Eileen.
All right. Hi, everyone. Eileen Mihas. I'm the program director at MDIC for the Early Feasibility Studies program. And Colin, you can advance the slides. Yep. Another one forward. Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to give a brief background on who MDIC is and what we do, and then a little bit of EFS, and I'll leave it at that and pass it over to Devi. So MDIC is a 501c3 public-private partnership, and its sole objective is to advance regulatory science for patient benefit. We currently have over 75 members, 900 subject matter experts. The company has created over 70 resources, and there's 50 active working groups. And so through stakeholder collaboration with FDA, medical device manufacturers, patients, researchers, clinicians, and payers, MDIC works to develop new approaches and tools for addressing pain points and shared challenges among key stakeholders. And we work to deliver high impact work, and that includes frameworks, best practices, toolkits, and education. MDIC works under 4 pillars or core areas, and those include quality design and manufacturing, evidence generation, digital technology and transformation, and patient engagement. And under those, we have multiple program areas, the NEST initiative, incorporating real world evidence, health economics and patient value, clinical diagnostics, digital health, and clinical science, as well as advanced manufacturing. And Andy just gave the brief overview for the EFS initiative. So just want to reiterate, it's ultimately to provide US patients with access quicker to groundbreaking medical technologies. And I just want to briefly go over some of the benefits to both the clinical sites as well as our industry partners. So by doing your EFS, it allows the clinical research sites to gain early access to do medical devices and helps to foster the growth of the research program. And it also helps to familiarize the sites with the device, the protocol, and the procedure prior to starting your pivotal, and also helps to strengthen the relationship between the clinical site and industry sponsor. And by aligning with regulatory timelines of US clinical sites, it helps to maintain that competitiveness compared to overseas. And you'll hear this multiple times today, but one of the most important aspects of EFS for industry partners is engaging with FDA in early and frequent communication, and that helps to facilitate smoother negotiations when coming up to your pivotal. And this slide, I just want to briefly touch base on some of our current initiatives. As Vivek said, we had success within the structural heart, and we want to expand that within electrophysiology, neurovascular, and heart failure, as well as working towards other therapeutic categories. And another initiative under development in MDIC is collaborating with FDA to create risk-based strategies for biocompatibility requirements in the EFS program. Coming up in mid-January, we are going to have our kickoff meeting for the EFS Clinical Site Network, and that's going to work towards continuing to streamline issues at the site level and create a network of sites with both EFS experience and sites who want to engage in EFS. And as is the reason for the roundtable today, we are proactively reaching out to the startup community to raise awareness about all of the resources that MDIC has to offer. And go to the next. Yeah, and this is some of the resources that MDIC and the EFS program have completed, and a lot of these are in the EFS toolkit. And I just want to highlight the EFS Master Clinical Trial Agreement, which is a great resource for startup companies. And on this next slide is just the QR code that you can access the entire toolkit, and it has my contact information as well as Keondae Irvin's, and we will circulate this after the roundtable. And I will hand it off to Devi. She's going to talk about her site experience.
Thank you, Eileen. I am waiting for, there you go, perfect. So thanks, Pete and Vivek and Eileen for this opportunity. What I want to do today is just go over our experience with structural early feasibility studies and just show our learnings and hopefully go from there. So these are my disclosures. So just to put things in perspective, just if I look at the U.S. map, we're from this part of the world, and here we are in Northeast Arkansas, from a town in Jonesboro, which is not a really big academic place, and I think that's one of the big things I want to highlight, is that this is truly a small town community hospital that is embarked in clinical trials. And our research group is Arrhythmia Research Group, which was founded in 2018 with as a solution to create a quality EP program with the vision to empower our patients with choices to get quality care and to have access to newest science through clinical trials. And over the last many years, we as a group have done multiple local registries, investigator-initiated trials, industry-sponsored clinical trials, and multiple industry-sponsored IDE trials. And this is kind of a list of almost most of the trials that we've been through, with over about 2,000 patients currently enrolled or being followed in clinical trials through the research group. So in about 2020, we kind of took a look at our trials, and we decided that we were at a point where we had done a reasonable number of clinical trials with significant ID trials and gone through a couple of audits and done well. And so we were ready for kind of the next step. And the question at that point was, what is the next step? And that is where we started venturing into the world of early feasibility studies. And at that point, the structural space was what was open for early feasibility studies. And we were looking for a partner. And the first structural EFS that we engaged in was with the conformal device. Conformal had just started their early feasibility work and had 10 sites, which the way I looked at it, it was pretty spread out in the US with pretty great diversity among academic and private practices, but also just ICs and EPs. So it was a great collaborative option for us. So what I want to just show you is the timeline of how our conformal kind of trial worked out. And you can see it started in May of 2020. And by the time we finished recruitment, it was April of 2022. And it was a great learning curve for us. So just to break it down, from the time when we started in May 20, COVID kind of hit and things got put on hold big time. And we had to restart the whole process around February 2021. And you can see it took us about 40 days to kind of get to the budgeting process, which I think was not unreasonable for a site that was pretty early in a budgeting process for an early feasibility. But there were things that we learned through that. This is just an experience from just the conformal trial, and within all the clinical all the 10 sites, the fastest site with time to budget was about 26, and the slowest was about 300. It's a wide variation. And you can see the number of rounds that they went through back and forth was about 2 versus 5. And one of the key things that, after talking to the conformal folks, is that the fastest sites were more responsive and had a single contact compared to the slowest site that were not as responsive with emails or whatnot, and had multiple contacts that they had to deal with. So from the point of the budget completion in March of 2021, it took us about 95 days to get to IRB approval. And that was a lot of learning experience as well. And we had to go through about 4 IRB meetings, and possibly because we didn't anticipate it, as this was our first EFS, and there were a lot of questions raised about why EFS in Northeast Arkansas and why EFS at our site. And after about 4 rounds, we got IRB approval. From IRB approval on, it took us about 29 days to get to our first SIV. And I have to say, it's around that time when we had the Delta variant. And I think we had reasonable scheduling issues and stuff, but there were things that we learned. This was one of the other things that we saw, is from the time we got into SIV to first patient was pretty long for, at least for us. There were things from our sponsor that we ran into issues with them not ready to actually start the trial, even though we had, been on this path for a while. We had issues on our side where we were not ready to consent. We were just not ready there were a lot of issues that came in, coordination of first cases and a lot of things. But once we had the first patient in, it took us about 130 days to kind of finish our recruitment. And we did relatively well with 10 total patients enrolled out of a 43, which is about 23% of the study cohort, which I thought was pretty reasonable. And the trial is now in an early feasibility, outside of early feasibility, in a pivotal IDE trial. So with this, we looked back, and when we look back at our work, we looked and said, what can we do better? And that's a point where, I started engaging with MDIC. And there, as Eileen said, there are so many resources there, especially the study templates that we started learning from our own mistakes. And this is the second early feasibility study that we engaged in, and laminar is another LA closure device with the rotational LA system. And again, you can see our timeline. We started in March 28th of 2023, and kind of within 4 days had our documents and everything. By day 57, we had all of our ICF and our CTA done. Well, CTA was executed by day 70. And I do believe that there's stuff that we can still work on there, but it was a dramatic improvement from how we did with conformal. Now, the times were also different. We were past the COVID phase. From there, you can see, our IRB approval, we started all these work simultaneous. And that's one thing we learned from conformal, is not to wait for one step to be over for the next step to start. And we kind of started early, and you can see by day 71, we had IRB approval. Within 2 days, we were ready for our SIV, because the sponsor was also on board with us in working with us from day one to kind of moving things along, which helped quite a bit. They did not wait for us to get IRB approval to get to SIV. And we were ready with patients. We had our consenting process in place, and within 5 days, we were ready to enroll our first subject. And by day 118, the last subject was enrolled, which I thought was, this was a big move forward for us from conformal, and we hope to continue to make this better. And to kind of summarize, I think from our experience, what we think makes or breaks an early feasibility experience from a investigator standpoint is having an engaged PI and an engaged team with an established program. You need a really well infrastructured kind of a deep CSU support and a clinical program that has a volume, with unified leadership, with administration to get this going. And what we think of as future is to work in collaboration with MDIC to help create workflows from our learnings and to learn from best practices from other sites to hopefully make this better. So with that, I'll stop and hand over to Olav Bergheim. Olav is going to talk his perspective from the industry side. Thank you.
Thank you, Devi. And if I get access to sharing the screen here, I can show a couple of slides as I'm talking. Just put some of it on slides easier to point out. Let me see here if I can enlarge this thing here. Let me see. So in brief, so we have some experience already through our early feasibility trial. This is in the area of ventricular tachycardia. And we notice that the purpose here of this is to remove the so-called barrier for conducting clinical trials. And it's a collaboration between the three parties, FDA, clinical site, and sponsor. And we have to say that has been a great communication in all respect. And I will share with you the pluses and minuses as I see. The conclusion will be I'm very positive to work this way, but we have also learned a lot. And maybe one of the things we learn is that there is a fourth party here that we need to we need to solve this one. At least in our case, we ran into a discussion with the CMS that were not on board with us. They were not necessarily willing to accept that there was a program here that has an intention to work this out in a relatively short time. And I try to summarize in here in the next slide what are the pluses and minuses that we saw. And I would say so. The FDA gave us the IDE letter that states category B. And by the way, maybe I should mention first and foremost, the FDA approval time here, or the communication, etc., was the shortest I ever could have thought about. Not only did they understand the early feasibility program, but they also have experience to share and how we can do things. And I will have to say that's a 5+ in any way I could say. But the next experience was a little bit different. When we submitted this to the CMS, they more or less said that they didn't need to accept any categorization from FDA. They wanted to do their own. They were not even sure it should be a category B. And we went back and forth on this in a couple of times, and actually needed Andy and Peter to help us even to how to solve that. And I see Anish is on the phone on the screen here. This guy is worth gold in terms of being creative and thinking about how to help this process. So I think we had this triangle with that I showed first, but this is one area that we learn from, and I think actually for other people who wants to go into this, we can share some of that experience, how we try to solve it. But I still think there is an opportunity here to get them somewhat on board with this program. As an example, FDA, since this is a VT trial, the outcome measurements here are a 6 months period. CMS said, no, we don't accept any 6 months. We want to have survival data, and that's 12 months. So now it's a discussion back and forth about how that is. And what I'm missing the most, I think, with the CMS discussion, there is nobody to call, if you want. There is an organization. I'm not so sure how to get to there. With regard to the people we deal with FDA, there is an extreme, unbelievable responsiveness. We know we can send out a quick question, and there is an answer immediately. With the CMS, I'm sending it into some office, and I don't know who is in that office and where it is. So that's something that I think we need to work on together. There is one other that we run into, and CMS requested an IRB approval before they would even look at the application. Now, we had 4 sites in our clinical CMS trial, and fortunately, one of the 4th site, and that's actually Mount Sinai, were willing to approve and do an IRB approval review, etc., contracting, without having the CMS approval. If it wasn't for that, we would be stuck, because CMS said that, no, we are not opening this file till you have IRB. And if the site then said that, well, we won't look at it till CMS approval, it will be stuck that way. So I think that's something we can all work. All of this is solvable, but I think it's important to be aware of this for others. It may be different in a different trial. Maybe CMS have a different categorization, if you want. It all ended good, but it took a long time. And in our case, the FDA IDE approval was done in probably 30 days, if not less. It took took 9 months before we could enroll the first patient, and that 9 months was due to what I just explained. Was it not for the advice here from Peter and Andy and others who helped discussing and solving this, could even have taken longer time. Now I put up here just because in VR industry, for us, of course, time and money is everything. And when I compare what the options are, just to put that up there, the option for us is to go to Europe, as an example, where the process is different. We get the competent authority and the site IRB approval, and then there is no CMS in the middle, if you want, we can then start enrolling. And while during the same period here, before we got to the first patient, we enrolled 30 patients on this trial in Europe. You know, the benefit of working with people here in the US, working with the FDA, working with the sites, etc., is without comparison. So clearly, I am high on this program. I'm supportive to it. I'll do anything I can to help here and offer up my phone number here in case anybody else want to do this and helping to solve it and etc. And finally, I said, so this is the recommendation from the sponsor point of view. I would say for FDA, continue the good work. This is a good program. I'm supportive. When I see the support coming from that side, this is something I like to do again. And with regard to the CMS, I will say they are not on here, but they should be on. Get on board with the program. One way or the other, we need to get them to understand that they need to help this to make sure that this is a smooth process. And with regard to the clinical side, they need to think about this, and I think that varies from place to place. Not so much the electrophysiologists as the organizations they are part of, I think. And they need to take the risk and process an IRB and contracting, etc., before they have the CMS approval. I think it is a smaller risk, because if there is an adjustment due to the CMS or something, you can always go back and fix that. So that's really where I am. I'm happy participant in this thing, and thank you for you guys who have been sponsoring and driving it. I'm pleased to be part of it. Thank you. And I think I'm handing it back to you, Peter.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna share my screen then as well. And you guys able to see?
Yeah,
Okay, there you go. Good. And I'm actually going to skip over a couple of these and get right to the meat of the matter, because I did mention that we've been busy with MDIC promoting this whole space, but now it's time to get practical. So really the idea is now, can we walk the walk as well as talk the talk? And I appreciate the opportunity to follow Olav and Devi in particular, because I think from the Devi perspective, we are aspirational in trying to follow in the footsteps of what she has created. And importantly, in quite a different environment, where we don't really have that level of control over our sort of more closely held workspace, where instead I work for Banner and University of Arizona. Every contract that takes place isn't just a two-way contract between the site and the sponsor, but three between, again, Banner and University of Arizona and the sponsor. We're a large organization, and I think that, of course, brings with it its own challenges. And really raises the question, can centers like ours actually do this kind of thing? I know Paul will at some point share his thoughts about what goes on at Stanford. Vivek obviously at another large center, although they seem to maybe have broken down one of the important barriers that Olav just mentioned in the CMS thing. Because as I'll share, we are actually one of the sites as well to work with Adagio. And before I forget, though, at some point, Devi, I want to go back to you, because one piece I'd love to know in relation to what Olav just said is, with laminar and conformal, who took care of the money, right? So that's one, where was the CMS piece in this versus others? So leave that to later, but I'd love to hear that piece of how those companies overcame what Olav ran into. So, why are we a site that wants to do this? Well, we have a lot of motivation to do this. We have a new model, new leadership. Rod Tung joined us as our new chairman of cardiology 2 years ago. That worked well in timing with what I was getting up to here. We have a dedication to excellence in research and a long history of working in IDE studies and others. Wilbur Sue, who many of you may know, is also in our group. And we've had dozens of IDE and other trials work through our center. And we clearly saw the potential benefits of doing EFS, including early exposure of our patients to new tech, early exposure of ourselves to new tech, and really as well a signal to sponsors that we're a place to be for early studies, and then of course to also participate in the follow-up studies as well. So, really in some ways, even though it seems like there may be a lot of work to get going for a very small number of patients on the EFS, it does bring with it sort of a halo effect, I think, as well, of being involved early. Of course, the challenge I just mentioned, everybody who works with us has a 3-party agreement of the sponsor and University of Arizona and Banner. And really our history is terrible from that perspective. 9 to 12 month startup times. At some point we'll give you a chapter and verse, some of the struggles going to the very last day, in fact, and almost losing studies that then we turned out to be the #1 enroller in, and really came down to the money and the lawyers. From an infrastructure perspective, again, strong track record of conducting numerous clinical trials of different complexity, but never an EFS. And part of moving this forward is when Rod Tung got to us, he put together, he loves acronyms, right? So this is known as the SCREW, but Specialized Cardiac Research Unit. So again, a dedicated and expanded research team with its own resources trying to move this forward. So really we saw this as a challenge and opportunity to really smash, honestly, the existing paradigm. Can we turn 9 to 12 months into 60 days? And so I need to put this together in a way that is as easy to show as what Devi did. I apologize for not being as intuitive as she is, but basically we were able to move along initially quite quickly. From week 1, we did a quick feasibility approval. We had the draft clinical trial agreement submitted to Banner Legal with a budget pending. This is within the first 2 weeks. Day 17, we had the budgeting team working on things as well. U of A was going back and forth with Banner. And by week 3, we had conditional approval, but this is where things kind of got halted, because at that point it became unclear how the funding and CMS approval was moving forward for the project. Still, we had more discussions amongst our research group, and following the further discussion, agreed to move forward in principle at this point. But this is where we ran into what Olav mentioned, is the inability of our center to move forward until CMS was officially on board. So our first procedure didn't happen. If you look here, we're in January, February, and our first patient was enrolled in September. Okay, so what happened in between? Well, the FDA protocol and our clinical staff were ready to go right up front. The pause was clearly due to lack of CMS approval for coverage. Our center and sponsor could not proceed without that in place. FDA leadership and the sponsor team were put together in person. I remember clearly grabbing the Adagio folks and walking them over to Andy Farb at Stanford Biodesign in New Orleans, right? And initiating this discussion. So, this was incredibly valuable to do this, but clearly this can't be a one-off every single time in this way. We need to create a process that's effective for this. And then beyond that, again, it required 3 separate rounds of communication with CMS in order to get this over the finish line from Olav's perspective. There again, there were clinical data expectations and study design he mentioned, including things like follow-up. Can we express to them that EFS is a unique thing? What's reimbursement concerns? What's the policy for Medicare versus private insured patients in case of injury? What's the role of the sponsor in providing reimbursement? And how does that run into the Medicare secondary payer rules? And each of those rounds took several weeks to communicate. And that, I think, is just a huge barrier there as well. And so honestly, by the time we had started, Adagio had completed more than 60 cases in Europe, as well as some compassionate cases in the US. So I'll leave it at that for now, and pass it on to Andy and Hetal to discuss the FDA's role from that perspective, and after sharing our experience there.
Great, thanks, Peter. Colin, can we get our slides up, please?
Yep, just one moment.
Sure. While he's bringing that up, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Hetal Odobasic. I'm currently the Division Director for Cardiac EP Diagnostics and Monitoring in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices at FDA. And we really appreciate the perspectives that have been shared so far. So as we continue to hear about what has worked well, what needs to be worked on moving forward, we recognize that this is not a one and done roundtable. We want this discussion to continue as we brainstorm solutions. But we thought it would be a good opportunity to also briefly share a few common misconceptions about EFS. Next slide, please. So some believe that since it is an IDE study, typically that all non-clinical assessments must be completed prior to initiating the study. So we wanted to clarify that, the fundamental premise of EFS is that the device design may evolve, and we recognize that testing is definitely impacted accordingly. So our reviews have focused on mitigations for any potential clinical consequences that might be due to certain failure modes and just overall impact on patient safety. So one should note that there are even assessments deferred during pivotal studies. I know we're not talking about that today, but that would be reviewed more closely during the time of marketing itself, versus what's only needed to ensure patient safety before starting a clinical study. And that's the process that we would encourage everyone to interact with us on very early during design, so that we can alleviate some of those burdens in testing, the timeframes, and you're only doing what's absolutely needed. And many also assume that if you want to pursue first in human in the US, that it needs to be an EFS. And I know we're promoting EFS here today, but we wanted to note that it may not be appropriate for all. And that's why we want to encourage the conversations and talking to us early in design. You'll hear me say that over and over again. Because sometimes you're close to final design. I think that's pretty common in the EP world. I think we're learning more about that too, where not much is going to change with the catheter per se, but we want to ensure that where it is possible, we are aligning in device development in the United States so that we're actually furthering the field here for EP. And additionally, animal studies are a point of misconception commonly. Good laboratory practices or GLP, they're in place to help ensure appropriate conduct. But when non-GLP studies are evaluated, we focus on the deviations from practices to ensure they were justified, they don't compromise the validity of the study results, and that we can ultimately still use the data that was collected and move things forward. But this is also an area where, we encourage the interaction so we can work on those protocols when you're planning the study, not after it's completed and, worrying about the next phases. But here are some facts as well. These studies are intended to be small. However, they can easily be expanded as more data becomes available and transition between study development stages under the same IDE. We're not talking about various IDEs, but you would submit supplements and we would work through those interactions. And overall, we aim to streamline this cadence and continue interacting on the device throughout the entire development until it gets to the market. It's not a one and done, and many believe they need to start each step all over again every time a change is made to the device or a protocol update, but that's not the case. So the program is intended to facilitate review of design changes based on the clinical input gained from the studies. That's the whole point, and really learn as we go. So I just wanted to emphasize that. Next slide, please. So overall, we believe there are several benefits to pursuing an EFS in the US. I won't read all of these out to you all. I think you heard a lot of it earlier. But they all lead to what we believe is more efficient time spent in the United States with our clinical users, our patients, and our regulatory infrastructure. So we'll be hearing about challenges and experiences overall, the rest of the roundtable today, and better inform our next steps. So we really want to start thinking about more of the solutions. And as Pete says, really, walk the walk and talk the talk. We've been talking about it for a while, but if you feel, just based on what you've heard today, that our team, hasn't taken these principles into account when reviewing something for you, or you're unsure, just reach out. You can reach out to me directly, Anish, Andy, just our group overall, and we'd like to continue the the conversation and follow up, because many times it's just a slight disconnect in what was communicated or the interpretation. And we'll continue to move this forward. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Vivek and we'll keep things going.
Thanks a lot, Hetal. That was fantastic. I especially like the myths and facts slide. I think I just learned a couple of things there too. I really want to, we have a number of other folks here that we want to get involved. I'll just quickly talk about our experience. We're probably somewhere between, Devi Fast and Pete and Paul in terms of how our process is at Mount Sinai in New York. I think the conformal experience was overall favorable, but that was also during COVID, so I think that's a little bit complicated to try to understand. And frankly, I think a lot of us learned a lot during the conformal EFS process. The laminar experience at Sinai was actually quite good. I think, just to give you an idea without going through in all the detail again, I think we did our first couple of cases maybe a week or so after Devi did. So overall, even with our somewhat more, let's say, cumbersome, laborious process at Sinai, we were okay. Now with Adagio, I think the CMS issues have been well documented now, and I don't want to talk about them again. But we're enrolling now. We've done a couple of cases. We have a few more, and I think that overall things are now going quite well. So I think what I'd like to do is really turn it over, and we have a couple of different people from industry and others who are at different stages. So what I thought is, let's start with Randy. So Randy Lashinsky is the CEO of Laminar Medical, and I'd really like to have Randy talk about his experience, and particularly both the experience, which I think has already been somewhat documented, but also, Randy, you just are about to start your pivotal trial. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that process also.
Sure, appreciate that, Vivek. For industry, from a startup perspective, really the key to note here is that clinical data is our best currency. So we have a balance between how much cash we spend versus how much runway we have and versus our timeline. So I understand the conversations about money and CMS, but a lot of times you have to ignore some of those and just headlong through and spend the money just to get things done, to get some clinical data under your belt. I do applaud the FDA for the experience we had. The communications I think that we've had with them have been very consistent, very clear. I would encourage anyone who's interested in starting an EFS to start communicating early, because to everyone's point on this, as you do communicate, you get more information. It's not a big, scary organization. Everything deals with relationships. Both with Vivek and Devi, we've had great relationships with the individuals and also with the organizations, trying to explain what it is we need for timelines, which I think is key. So starting those timelines on the contracting is very important. There was a question on getting through the issues of CMS and dollars. And again, we ran headlong through the whole COVID issue and went overseas to start this project, and then came back to the US with some data, some information to go to the agency. And they've been very, very welcoming. They've been very communicative with us. We've been a very, I think, good, fair partner with them, and they've reciprocated with great communications and great ability for us to get into this EFS program, which I completely agree has been fantastic for us. So a couple of the notes I was taking here, Devi, I appreciate your timelines. Those were great. I think what we do as industry also, we look at every aspect of our business is how we can compress those timelines. Again, everything we do deals with dollars and time. So sometimes we have to make that sacrifice and pay that extra money to get those fee cases done. But it gets us currency. Then when we come back to the agency, we come to an investigator and say, we've got 1 year data, 2 year data, whatever it is, and some more experience. The contracting from our perspective, some are very good. Devi is an exceptional site with that. There's other sites around the US, not you, Vivek, but have taken much, much longer. And again, that all comes down to relationships. And sometimes you just have to wait them out. What I will say is that industry will find the slipstreams, the easier, the better relationships to make with sites, with investigators and so forth. So if we're given resistance, we will still pursue that site possibly because of a political or a geographic region, but we'll also then move and migrate quickly towards a site that will give us quicker response times and so forth. So overall, the dealings with the agency have been fantastic. I'll mention one other thing with quality systems and so forth. From industry's perspective, it's a migrating process. We start with a very basic one, and then as we mature, we start enhancing that. But suffice it to say, every product we put in, ours is much different because we have a permanent implant versus the EP.
but every product we put into every patient, we look at qualities as a paramount portion of our product and our responsibility. So coming to the agency with a safety profile, whether it's GLP data, whether it's clinical data, has been something we've been very, very transparent on, and they've been very responsive. So coming down to the leadership of the agency, I can't applaud you guys more on this. We will get through the CMS portions of this, but that's in due time. Vivek, I don't know if you have any specific questions that I missed.
Yeah, well, just one very specific one. If you want to just talk about your transition from EFS to, well, you're still in the process, but
sure. Yeah, I think we started with 15 patients the agency gave us, and then we made 2 more blocks of that. So we did a 45 patient EFS, I think over a period of 9 or 12 months. The enrollment was fantastic. So applauding the supporters of our clinical sites that quickly found patients for us. And then the next phase for us is to obviously evaluate that data, review it with the agency, and then provide a submission for this pivotal trial. As you said, Vivek, we had received a letter recently that we can start that. We have a few things we want to clean up, but we're anxious to get started in our pivotal trial as quickly as possible. And so that negotiation then begins again with the RB approvals and the contracting and so forth. So we will blanket the US with the sites that we need and want, and whichever site comes up first, that's generally what we do is find the sites that provide us the easiest pathway, the most meaningful way to get in. Also, as a note, I'll say one thing we did during COVID, we were concerned with the ability to travel outside the US and in the US. So we looked at sites geographically that are on our West Coast where we're located in case we had to drive or take small commuter planes. But so it's really a matter, again, I can't stress enough from an industry perspective at looking at these slipstreams where we can find avenues to find the quickest way, the quickest path to get some of this clinical data.
Randy, I have a question for you. Could you be more explicit then about how you navigated the patient coverage aspects of this, CMS, et cetera? What stage, how did you avoid running into what Olav ran into?
Yeah, sometimes, well, this early data for us, it's only 45 patients. So sometimes we just had to eat the data or eat the dollars and just get the patients done. So these patients, again, are expensive, but as you can understand, the timeline for us is basically dollars. So we've got a certain amount of dollars, which is runway for us. So sometimes we have to just get that clinical data and pay those costs. These patients become very expensive early on, but it pays in dividends when you start referring to the long-term timeline. There's a lot of flat squirrels out there trying to make decisions on the road that have gotten run over. But I think making these decisions quickly and getting that clinical data for us was far more valuable than looking at the dollars it's going to cost for the reimbursement and so forth.
So you self-insured, and if there was a complication, you would have paid the patient?
No, for the insurance, we did have clinical trial insurance and so forth behind all that. So we paid for the devices, we paid for the procedures, et cetera. So those were costly procedures for us because we reimburse the hospitals for everything.
Yeah, let me just make one comment, Pete. I understand your concern about this. Appendix closure is different than ablation. So appendix closure is never going to get covered until it's to a randomized trial. So the companies have to pay for it. So that's just a different animal. So the issue of category B designation is an issue that will come up, and maybe Bram or others can address it later. I want to bring in, most of the companies we have discussing here are earlier stage companies, but we also, and the ones that we'll be speaking in just a minute, but I also want to bring in Hassan Labey from Abbott, who, and I'd like to get their perspective as a larger company that's obviously doing pivotal trials, but also has their own internal earlier stage stuff. So Hassan, if you wouldn't mind commenting on your perspective on this.
Yeah, good morning and thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. So actually, this is my first time during this meeting. So yeah, so for Abbott, I think I can speak from my previous experience, and just to let you know, I just joined Abbott's EP Electrophysiology as a DVP of Regulatory Affairs. But from my prior experience, actually, I worked with the NanoStem leadless pacemaker back in the days. And I think that was a great experience, even though it was not an early feasibility, but I think we had a good interaction with the FDA back in the days when we initially started this CE marking process with the first in man in EU. That was in 2013, 2012, 2013. But later on, I think we we came back to the FDA and we started our IDE. And I think it was a great experience interacting with the FDA on that, quick approvals. There was some challenge with CMS, but I think overall the process went really well. As far as EP, I think we are looking, now I'm EP, actually we're looking for opportunities for our new products and how can we engage with the FDA, engage with CMS, and do this type of early feasibility studies. And I think my question, I guess, to the panel here is mostly of these early feasibility studies are for class 3 products, ablation catheters. But there are some products like that class 2 diagnostic catheters. How can we get an early first in man for these catheters before going, for example, to the FDA? Want to know more about these catheters before getting a 510K clearance. And I think that's something that we also need to think about to understand that may work well for class 3 products because you need a PMA, you need clinical safety and efficacy to get approval. But sometimes for class 2 products, it's 510K. You could just look for a predicate. But in some cases, companies, they want to get some experience on this product before even getting clearance for it. And do I need clinical data to get clearance? Probably in some cases, maybe not, right? For a 510K. But in some cases, you want to learn more about the product.
Oh, that's great. Actually, we have a number of people still to get involved in discussion, but maybe Andy or Hetal, do you just want to quickly address that issue of different class, lower class devices?
Yeah, sure. I can keep it brief and of course follow up offline too. So regardless of whether you're using the data for marketing or not, if you were pursuing an IDE to get that experience and there's significant risk involved and we're evaluating it, it's still an option on the table. It's not ruled out. Same considerations come into play.
That's great. I want to bring in a couple other earlier stage companies. So first, Steve Mickelson, who's the CEO of Field Medical, an early stage EP company. Steve is joining us from somewhere in the eastern part of Europe, I think. So Steve, please, hopefully you can hear us. You're on mute, Chief. You're on mute, I think.
Oh yeah, well, I'll repeat myself. I'm in Slovenia right now at the Ljubljana meeting. On some electroporation stuff. It's exciting. This pathway in the United States, I've known about it for a long time, been very interested in it. And what has limited my why we kind of chose to go to Europe, I think originally is to really the cost, like Randy points out, there's a lot of cost in the enrollment speed and the duration of time it takes to get a site up and running in the United States. Those are not the FDA's fault by any means. So, I was, Olav really opened my eyes today to this this particular problem with CMS, which hasn't really been on our radar. And as we get ready for our first in man for Field Medical, to move to our first in man clinical experiences, we have no intention of running a very large trial. We really like this little small pilot study kind of size, really and analyze what our class 3 devices doing, whether we have to adjust the technology, even and dosing workflow, those types of things before we continue on and invest in a very large pivotal trial. And so this has been really helpful for me. I don't know if I have any insights from this stage of a company other than the fact that what Randy points out from my point of view is our runway is limited, and every day that we wait for somebody to approve something, we're running out of money. And so, time is very important.
No,
Stephen, can I add something to that real quick? Because I think what we did is very similar to what you did going outside the US, but simultaneously in parallel, we started to have these conversations. So again, this portion of time, we can have those conversations early, establish that relationship, and shorten that timeline or compress it. So everything we do is in parallel. So we try to do as much as we can outside the US with the US and try to get optionality for us to try to find patients. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the key points that I think I've heard Andy say about once every time we've had this meeting, which is don't think of it as an either or, but consider both. Can I also introduce Bill Nape from who's VP of ClinReg from Pulse Biosciences, also an early stage AF ablation, a company that's working on AF ablation device, and also before first in human. So Bill, you want to provide your perspective on this?
Sure. We Pulse Biosciences, we're in a different clinical area to start, and we just now moved into the cardiovascular space in EP technology. We already had CE mark. We were down the road with multiple FDA clearances. What helped for us to get our first in human study going is that I applied to Europe with a CE marked system, and I was just trying to expand it in another area. So that's kind of my perspective, is that I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to have a system that was already CE marked, and I was just expanding it, and we got first in human quite quickly to start a study over there. Otherwise, I would start with the EFS program with FDA. I've done it before and been very successful that way. But for us, it was helpful to go to Europe at this time. It also saved us a little bit of money going that pathway instead of pursuing a US path.
No, that's good. I also want to introduce Sarah. Sarah Khalil is the CEO of CoreMap. CoreMap is a little bit different. It's not really an ablation company. It's a company that's really, well, it's working on a mapping system to help target atrial fibrillation. So it potentiates, I guess, intervention. So Sarah, can you give us your perspective on this?
Sure. Great conversations. I feel like I'm among my peers. I think it was Randy who first said about the interaction between a venture-funded company and timelines. And we actually put a burn rate on every day. And if we have to wait for something for a month, we can put a dollar sign on it. So oftentimes you just have to bite the bullet and go ahead and pay for something that it would, the negative effect of waiting would outweigh paying for it. So I appreciate that comment. As Dr. Reddy said, we're an EP mapping company. Our value proposition is to electrically guide ablation in patients with AF where PVI is inadequate. And so we've developed a complete mapping system. We have a novel catheter with roughly 100 micro-scale electrodes. We've performed many preclinical studies here in the US. We performed what was deemed to be a non-significant risk study, clinical study here in the US to acquire our first epicardial AF data, and then made the decision to run a series of pilots. And as it was mentioned here, this is not an either or, but we're starting our pilots in Europe. And so the first pilot will be intended to be a mapping study only, not guiding ablation, where we can confirm our data science algorithms. We acquire incredibly large data sets with this microscale catheter. So our value proposition there is aggregating large sets of local conduction velocity data to inform driver sites for AF. And so we found the process in Europe very fast, straightforward, ethics committee approval, contract negotiation, and we're preparing our submission now to the competent authority from a safety perspective, and we'll do that first feasibility data acquisition only study in Europe. Then we have a couple of pilots that we're going to have to make some decisions on where we will guide ablation. So there'll be more complex studies. And the first one will be what we would consider a workflow confirmation, where we'll do just 10 patients. And then probably the study where we'll bring along our second path of the either or, and perhaps both, is when we do a 12-month study with, an ablation study with 12-month follow-up. So Anish and his group have been incredibly open to us. We have a novel catheter that there's really nothing that exists in the public domain that informs us on what those preclinical safety studies should look like. And they've been open to having conversations with us. So we greatly respect the agency for that. And that's kind of where we are.
Oh, that sounds good. I think I just realized that Chip and Tony have also joined. So Tony, maybe you could, Tony, you're with Biosense Webster, a much larger company, and maybe you could talk for a minute about your perspective. And you have multiple devices at various stages of regulatory approval. And as you hearing this discussion, how does that influence you one way or the other in terms of how you think about the EFS program?
Yeah, thank you, Vivek, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've been on since 5 a.m. listening, so really, really great conversation. And look, I think even I learned something, and I, on my side, continue to push for the opportunity to engage the FDA early. I think there were some key points that were made today. I think the early discussions with the FDA very critical. Randy made a good point about data being an important currency, and look, we're Biosense Webster, and we're part of Johnson & Johnson, and the notion that we have deep pockets so we can spend whatever money to get these programs going, even then, I think we need to think about how we use our dollars across all of our portfolio with programs that are in the early stages of development, all the way to things that are in post-approval studies. And when we think about the EFS, I think it's a great opportunity to engage the FDA early. So we have an advanced R&D facility in Israel, for example. And what I've said recently to them is, even if we're doing some early preclinical work and testing in Israel, we can take that data and have the early conversations with the FDA. I think this is very important. And I think there's also been some notion among large companies that perhaps we need to have a full-blown preclinical data and GLP before going into an EFS. I'm learning something new today that is not the case. And so by having these types of early discussions with the FDA, it allows us to actually make product iterations early. And then by the time we're moving into an IDE, and I think Randy's is a good example, because all of the early work that's been done allows Randy to then submit a robust IDE that becomes very iterative in conversation with the FDA. So I think this is a very important point, and something on our side I'll be continuing to push more of. I think the other part is site selection. There are some sites, and J&J is also guilty of the fact that our contracting process is extremely long. And so there are things that we can do on our side, but also partnering with the sites and doing work in parallel early on, I think paves the way for by the time when we're ready to move forward into the IDE. So I think there's a lot of steps that industry in partnership with FDA and sites can do to really move things forward. And it's, again, big lesson learned for us that, something that we need to do a lot more of. CMS, we've also had issues with, but I think that's another area where we can, continue to make some improvements.
Thanks, Tony. I want to bring Chip in. Chip comes from industry, but he's currently the board chair for EFS and MDIC and has been involved for, I guess, almost a decade, right? So when this first started in the structural heart space, and of course, outside areas outside cardiology. But Chip, you've heard some of the, overall, I think people have been pretty happy with where FDA is with the EFS program, at least now. You also heard some of the challenges with regards to CMS. I just wonder if you could provide some comments, both in terms of that, as well as where MDIC can help facilitate this process, like this webinar. You're on mute, Chip.
Sorry, thanks. I'm a little under the weather this morning, but glad to be here. The MDIC effort in this area has been going on for 6-7 years now, and I was there at the beginning a decade ago with Andy and Bram and others on developing this. And I come from industry, so I know how valuable it is for early stage companies to engage with the agency and to have their therapies be tested and evaluated in the U.S. ecosystem, where the funding is stronger and the valuations are more significant. So this is at the heart of the ecosystem for innovation in this space. What we've seen consistently over the years is that the FDA is a strong partner here and moves through the process fairly quickly. It is infuriating to me to find how often the lawyers for clinical sites and the lawyers for companies, seem to enjoy the sparring back and forth and, consume months and months of time that is very precious for the startups and for the large companies to do this for no real value add, as I could discern. But we seem to keep fighting that fight and getting better at it. And I think a lot of sponsors follow the slipstream, as Randy described, to pick the better sites that are more effective at that. The other issue is the CMS issue, and we've spent a lot of time over the last year and a half trying to evaluate that and why that is a bit of an issue. I think we've come to a view of what the best way for a startup to handle that issue is. And Eileen Mihas is on the line here, can be a point of contact on how best to handle that for a sponsor. But in short, get clinical trial insurance, and it covers more than you might realize. Have your lawyers cave early in the negotiations, and you'll save a lot of time and what's probably not a value added activity either. So we've got some perspective on this. I do think the companies that try and go direct to pivotal from a European approach typically miss a beat or two when it comes to the negotiations with the FDA. And so I think this parallel process is extremely valuable for startups. Get a few cases underneath your belt in Europe, but then come quickly to the US, probably in parallel to preserve your timelines. But the sooner you engage in the largest market in the world for medical devices, the better off a startup will be. So anyway, thanks very much for the chance to comment.
Thanks a lot, Chip. Bram, I'd like to bring you in on the discussion. I mean, my takeaway again from this discussion so far has been that with the various learnings, the interaction again with the FDA has been quite favorable. And again, I just learned a couple of things also in this discussion. But there is, of course, some static with regards to the CMS interaction. And I'm wondering if you could comment on where you see additional potential areas of improvement, if any, with FDA, because I think it's pretty good right now, but also how, if it's possible to bring CMS into this discussion more.
Thanks. First, I'd like to just thank everyone for their participation this morning. My name is Bram Zuckerman. I'm the Office Director for Cardiovascular Devices at FDA. And certainly, as has been noted by the other FDA speakers, EFS is of supreme importance to FDA CDRH, and we're always interested in feedback and improving the program. I think from what we've heard, we can all agree on the following. We're dealing with a complex clinical trials ecosystem. We're not going to get perfection overnight. But I do think I'd like to underline several themes that Tony from Biosense enumerated, because I do believe they're important. Number one, EFS is based on just-in-time testing. FDA CDRH EP division is really interested in making sure that we have efficient device development for your device. It might mean that, as Chip said, that you go to Europe first and then come to US, or do things in parallel, go to US first. But we really encourage early communication so that for your company, we can figure out the most efficient way. We realize the costs and times involved. Second thing is CMS is not going to be solved overnight. Our best advice is to turn to Dr. Andrew Farb at FDA, who has our conduit for the CMS interaction, as well as continuing to work with Chip on the broader issues. The final thing is that we really appreciate the feedback from industry sponsors, regardless of your decision. We need this continual feedback loop to continue to optimize the whole process. So don't be afraid to talk to us. We like the good, bad, and the ugly feedback. Thank you. I can't hear you.
committed the cardinal mute. I committed the cardinal mute sin. Anyway, before I turn it back over to Pete, I just wanted to make one or two quick comments. So, I think overall, I come out of this discussion feeling more favorable about the process and the experiences and the trajectory of the experiences than going into this. Just two quick comments. One about the not perfection. It isn't perfect, but I can tell you as someone who's also done a fair amount of work OUS, that's not perfect either. There's static in both situations. And the reality is that, as I think Randy said, industry will find the slipstreams. And I think it probably makes sense to look in both avenues, that it's not an either or. The second quick point is what Chip brought up about interaction with lawyers. And it's not just lawyers, it's IP, whatever. There's a number of different type of areas. The one thing that's very, very clear is that the PIs have the most important role here. If the PIs are pushing, it'll happen. If you let things happen because they're supposed to happen, they will happen over a time frame that you do not like. I mean, when things are going slowly, if the PI jumps in and stamps their feet, that really facilitates things. I think that's something that I think we PIs know it. We just have to do it. So anyway, with that, I think this has really been a really great discussion, and I'll turn it over to Pete and let you go ahead and close.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I know we're very, very short on time. I did want to give 1 minute apropos to exactly what you're talking about to Paul Wong, because I think we are also trying to lay the groundwork here for the clinical sites to be a good partner to you all. So Paul, in 1 minute, can you share what you're trying to put together as far as a national EP collaborative based at Stanford?
Yeah. Thanks so much,
sites?
everyone. Yeah, so what we're trying to do is really support the institutions, as you've heard, really get institutional champions, try to have institutions designate a single contact, have special resources like a startup specialist, and then really have all of the players, contracting, budgeting, legal, all on board ahead of time to create this consortium. So that's what we're moving forward with, and look forward to telling you more about it. We're doing it out of Stanford Biodesign. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so everybody stay tuned on that. We are trying to organize ourselves on the clinical side as well to provide those active resources that Vivek exactly led into with his comments there. And again, really just thanks to all the stakeholders here. We have a goal of having the people on this call continue to participate, spread the word. We'd love to see some protocols and discussions end up on Anish and Hetal's desk, as a result of this type of meeting. And we hope that this will be the first of many smaller focus meetings that we will be able to put on to move this forward. Thank you so much, and look forward to any feedback that you all have about how to continue to move this forward. I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you. And thanks to the organizers again.